Let's talk about a case study from a Canadian Wealth Secret listener and investor. This is a common question I think we get asked is let's unpack some moves, some strategies. What are the secrets for tax advantage structures, tax advantage moves that we can be making so that we're keeping more of our hard-earned money in our piles and making sure that we're hitting our financial goals. And I think we're all kind of on this pathway. And when we think about the 4 stages that we currently talk about here on the podcast, but also with our clients when we're helping them structure their financial plans, or with listeners like this person, a lot of times the conversation, Kyle, starts with what we would call stage 3, which is what this listener came with us. He's like, hey, I'm looking to learn more about how to effectively use the Smith Maneuver to optimize my strategies because I make a lot of money. My spouse doesn't. Maybe there's a way for me to make this work and take advantage of this disparity between my salary and hers and take advantage of that tax, space in there, which is optimizing the structure. That's stage 3 for us, is you thinking about your structures. Now, stage 1 is about vision and goal setting. Stage 2 is about, making sure that we have the right reservoir. Stage 3 is about optimizing structure. So a lot of times we get these conversations about what structure should I pick? Mm-hmm. But then it sometimes rolls back into, well, we could use that structure, but should we? And so what we're going to do in this episode is we are going to address and unpack this Smith Maneuver question about, should we be re-rolling, should I be using the Smith Maneuver, in my personal name or my spouse's personal name? We're going to talk about that. But then what we're going to do is we'll roll and unpack the vision part. But that vision part, we're probably going to roll into a second episode because I feel like we're going to chat here. So there's a lot to unpack with this listener. Kyle, let's dig into it. Give us a little background on this listener so that listeners now go, what are the pieces that we're working with here to help optimize this plan?
Yeah, we've got a couple. They've got a couple children, and actually a spread in ages of the children as well, which is really, interesting. And I'm sure, makes planning a little bit more challenging as well. So they have one that's sort of getting ready to move out of the house. Another one is very young, entering into school. They are about 40 years old each. Okay. So we're just going to call them around 40. The husband, as you've mentioned, earns a significant salary and bonus. So they've got about $400,000 coming in for the husband. We're going to call him Dan today. And the spouse has about $90,000 coming in. So a significant income, almost $500,000 on paper before taxes. Now, we know what happens to his $405,000. It becomes much less, of course. Mm-hmm. However, this is still a very, very healthy amount of income coming in. They own a primary residence with a very small mortgage relative to the value of the property. So value of the property is about 1.1 million and the mortgage is only around 350, right? So pretty low loan to value on the mortgage, which is great. This is fantastic. And they've done what we're going to call, quote unquote, all the right things in terms of investing. So he's filled up his RRSPs every year. Super smart for someone who's a T4 employee, can't control the income and how it's coming to them. For our business owner friends, that's going to look and sound very different. But for our friends that can't control this income, maximizing the 30,000-ish of room that you get every year is really important. He's already done that. That's great. Here's the challenge, though, for someone who's a high income earner, like we find in Daniel. He is only given up to about $30,000. Now, on someone who is earning $180,000 a year, that is exactly the 18% that you are allowed, the maximum contribution of an RRSP. The problem for him is that he earns more than double 180. That means that technically his RRSP room only represents around 9% of his annual salary. This is problematic if we trust that doing the right thing is simply filling up our RRSP, right? Which is something that you could easily fall into, because then he's paying himself less than 10% per year in doing so. Now, he does have some other investments as well, but nothing near as significant as the RRSP bucket, right? So This is a challenge for high income earners here in Canada, is that it's very easy to think like, it's like, I did what I was supposed to do. I filled up my RSP. I filled up my tax-free savings account. Now what do I do? Well, guess what? The more income we have, unless we're taking a significant portion thereof and actually investing it, it's likely that we're losing it to lifestyle creep. So this is some information we don't yet have from Daniel. And actually, that's his homework right now, is to actually go and figure out how much are you actually spending in after-tax dollars, so that we can help you plan forward and determine what is it that you actually need in order to make this stage 3 conversation that he sort of come to us with. Like he had said, he's like, I want to leverage my property in order to use Smith Manoeuvre to have more good debt instead of bad debt. So he wants to convert his primary mortgage into tax deductible interest instead of it being non-tax deductible. This is fantastic. But to what end? And like, what is it that we're trying to achieve? And if he does this, is it actually going to help him get to the bigger goals, which are essentially being able to retire by, in his case, 55, which is about 15 years off.
Right. Yeah. Like it's not even just asking, is it the right move? Or I guess, is it going to help? Because like, really the question is like, is it going to help enough? Like, is it worth it? Right. Like maybe there are other moves you could be making that get you there faster, closer, structure wise. Like that's an important question too. Cause it's like, yeah, we could do this. Sure. But is it the best move?
100%. And that's exactly it. Is like, what we can tell you is that if you do this Smith Manoeuvre and you do it well, and you're, patient, and you do all of those things, it's going to help. Right. But the question is it going to help enough? And, so one of the major questions here that we're going to address in this episode, but then in a future episode, we're going to talk about more like bigger picture. Today, we're going to address is like, his question is like, if I was to say fully pay off the mortgage using some unsecured, or not unsecured, unregistered accounts that he has, if he was to take that money, sell those assets, put it down on the mortgage, and then essentially reborrow a good chunk of equity. He hasn't specified if it's just to replace the current mortgage. Is it double the current mortgage? None of that yet is really known, but he's wondering, like, if I was to do that, should I or could I take that money and put it all in my name because I have the higher income? Or should I take that money and put it in my spouse's name in an unregistered account because she has a lower income? And I'm sure there's some people who have some sort of wheels turning right now, and they're going probably initial at first blush going like, why would you put it in the spouse's name when he could save a bunch in terms of the interest that he could write off against his very high salary? And we're going to dig into a few of the nuances here.
Well, what I like, especially if you're looking at his non-registered accounts, he's got a good chunk, between the spouse, between him in there to put down and, to cash in, take into the accounts, put on the mortgage to pay it all off. Now, if you can pay it all off, and he's, I think, close, then because he's got a renewal period coming up and he's at a low interest rate currently on this mortgage, right? Like he locked it in 5 years ago, and it's like, which was a prime time to be locking in that mortgage 5 years ago. Come renewal time in the next 6 months, that mortgage rate is not going to be what it was. And so I think this is a good move for him to use a Smith Manoeuvre in this case, whether it's his wife's or his, in a way, it doesn't matter, but we are going to get into like which one it should be. But doing the Smith Manoeuvre in one of those two cases is a good move here, because he's going to borrow the funds. He's going to pay off the mortgage. He's not going to then renew the mortgage. Now he has complete, there's no mortgage now. Then he's going to borrow, so he doesn't have to renew at a higher rate, but he's now going to have the HELOC, because he's going to borrow it on the HELOC at the rate of your HELOC, which is already going to be that higher rate, and now go and invest it, hopefully earn that return that's higher than that HELOC. But we also have done some episodes in the past that says it doesn't matter what the actual HELOC rate is for you to actually really make use of the Smith Manoeuvre. So head back, into some of the history of our episodes to understand that and learn about that. But what I like is because now also he's going to get that tax deduction. Now, let's unpack that. So he's making a good chunk of salary. His wife's making less than half of that. And so now we have to decide, does he put it on, is it now tax deductible to his income as an investment? If we were going to now put it into his registered or unregistered accounts and her unregistered accounts, which one of these do we do? Because like you're saying, it seems like a great move, because if you go with his, because now all of a sudden now we can write off that mortgage. It's not mortgage, it's a loan, but that same amount is now tax deductible on the interest portion to his income, which is going to lower the tax, which was at the higher rate. So that makes sense. So Kyle, why would we even consider doing it on the spouse?
Yeah. So, and this was actually this particular individual who brought this idea up, because immediately, like my first blush, thought is, hey, you've got such a significant income, put it on your name. That way you can write off essentially 53% of that interest, which is great. So that's going to take call it 5.5% if it's prime plus 0.5 right now, an extra 50 basis points on your home equity line of credit. You're looking at like 2.5 to 2.75% after you consider taxes. That's great. Like that's fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
On the spouse, she's going to be at a marginal rate of around 30%, depending on the province, but around 30%. So there's a big arbitrage here between their marginal tax rates. Now, or actually, I shouldn't say marginal, their average tax rates. Her marginal tax rate would be about 30%. So there's a good arbitrage there. And I like that at first blush. But his concern was, okay, we fast forward, we do this for, let's say, 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
And now we've got this big investment and it's all in my name. And now he's also got an RSP, which is closing in on $1 million right now. It's going to obviously continue to grow and compound into the future. He's now got a lot of the assets in his name. And when he goes to pull that income out down the road, he's going to once again sort of be stuck in a high tax bracket, whereas his spouse is going to have less assets in her name. She had been putting away less in her RRSP and in her defined contribution pension plans. And so when she goes to take money out, she's going to take out a small amount, get taxed a small amount. He's going to be taking out probably a larger amount for retirement income and therefore get hammered in taxes. So there's a lot of unknowns here because we don't know what is that number that they're actually spending today. And then if we project that out, like what does that look like into retirement as well? Like, do you need that same amount? They talked about the kids going to private school and, that obviously having a cost. Well, that's not going to last forever. So does that bring down your, annual spending by 10%, by 20%, by 30%? Like these are pieces that we're really going to have to work through in the visioning portion, in the visioning stage. But as of now, my gut wants to say I like him taking on more of these unregistered funds. However, we often talk about this idea that, even if later there's a big amount in his unregistered account, the part we often forget is there's also going to be a big debt sitting there against it.
Yeah.
Right. There's two options. One option is you kept paying the interest only on the actual loan balance on the actual property, and your investment account kept growing. That's going to keep your interest that you pay every year under control. But there's also some people who actually let the interest compound on the borrowed funds. So you have the compounding asset over here, and you have the compounding debt over here. And with more debt comes more tax deductible interest to write off, which could help to deal with some of his issue when he goes to pull money later in retirement from this unregistered account. So there's a lot of numbers and number crunching that we can do, but we really need to have a better sense as to like, what does the timeline look like? How much am I planning to pull out? And what kind of debt am I going to still have on the books that I have now a tax deduction that I can continue to write off against when I do pull money out of that unregistered account?
Right. So if he's planning for retirement in 14 years, he gets to write off that amount every year for 14 years, which could accumulate to a large tax savings comparison to his spouse, who was only going to be able to write off a smaller amount because of her salary in terms of the tax deductions that she's going to be earning. So I get that. So you're saying we need more info.
We 100% need more info. And we also need to know, depending on what you invest in, like let's pretend for a second that it was primarily capital gain investments. Now, some people are going to push back and say, listen, the CRA, you have to have the intent to earn income when you're writing off the interest on this investment loan.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, that is true. However, as long as there's no stated fact that a stock or an investment cannot pay a dividend, it typically can pass. Now, I say typically, double check with your accountant, make sure that everybody's happy with what you're deciding you're going to invest in. But you do not have to have all of your Smith Manoeuvre leveraged funds in dividend paying stocks, for example, right? Which is another misconception a lot of people have. But even if, let's say, you had all capital gain assets going on, and you were to sell all of the investment bucket 15 years from now, who knows what that number is going to be, right? We can compound it out and figure it out. But let's pretend there's $1 million capital gain. That $1 million capital gain in his name is going to trigger him basically $250,000 of tax on that $1 million capital gain. Not a very smart move to be pulling all of that in any given single year. Here's the thing. If she took on all these investments and she did the same thing, she's going to have the same problem because she's pulled $1 million capital gain in a single year. And now they're in the same boat anyway. So these are some of the sort of decisions that we have to make when we're planning so that, we don't, let's say, try to just pick the easy route and not really analyze what is likely to take place down the road.
I get that scenario, but it's likely that she's not going to cash in, come retirement, all of these capital gain assets all at once. You're gonna drip them out as if anybody would in terms of pulling from your retirement accounts.
No, exactly. And let's take another more realistic scenario. Right now, the household's bringing in about $500,000. Now, some of that money is obviously going away to tax, right? So his income, for example, is getting chopped almost in half, right? So he's taking home about $200,000, let's say. She's going to take home about maybe 70-ish, let's say. So about $270 after tax. If they continue to require that, I'm going to argue that into retirement, no more private school, not supporting the kids, those types of things. Maybe they need 200,000. Again, total assumption at this point until they know what they're spending and they really think through and plan through what they intend to spend into retirement. We can deal with inflation later. Mm-hmm. Let's just pretend in today's dollars, until we know that, it makes it really difficult for us to compare. But let's pretend it's 200,000 that they need. Right? If he takes the full 200,000 in his name, yes, that's going to pop him into a high tax bracket. Is he taking it as ordinary income? Some of it, yes, because the RRSP is going to be taxed as ordinary income. However, some of it may be capital gains, as we had mentioned. So even if he's in a higher tax bracket, it's still only going to be about half of the ordinary tax rate, given that we only pay on 50% of the capital gain. So we really have to figure out, what does this look like and sound like? And what kind of interest do we anticipate to be paying every year that is still tax deductible? So as we pay off this, or as we start pulling from this investment, we do have to keep in mind that, as we pull from the investment, that means less of that interest is going to be a write-off, right? Because you're now pulling that investment out and spending it in some way. So there is a lot of analysis to be done here. I would argue that if he's taking 100 and she's taking 100, then obviously they're going to pay less tax later. There's a real calculation that needs to be done here in order to figure out, where do we go next and what is the right move. And I'm telling you, John, my hunch is, we always say that usually the answer lies somewhere in between. And my thought is, why not look at how much money you're bringing in, how much money your spouse is bringing in, and find somewhere in the middle to go, you know what? If we're going to borrow $100,000 to do this Smith maneuver, maybe 100,000 is in her name, maybe 200,000 is in his name. Since he's bringing in more of the money in his name currently, that'll give him a slight tax advantage on the write-off for the next 15 years. However, she's going to get a slightly less advantageous tax write-off for the next 15 years. But then the roles will flip when we hit the time where we start pulling income out, right? He might get taxed slightly higher, but she'll be getting taxed slightly lower.
I like that approach because I think what you're doing is you're weighting you're using a weighted average here between the two different accounts. And to be honest, if you were not married and you were going into a deal with a partner, that's the way you would structure it. Like you would structure it based off how much you're contributing or how much, part is yours. And in that way, that makes a lot of sense, but also it gives you a little bit of both, the best of both worlds. So he's going to be able to write off that interest now, but then you're also going to be building the account on her side to be able to pull more money come income splitting time. So all of a sudden it's like now when we both retire and we know what the number is because we did the vision planning work, we know what number we need to pull. Now we can go, well, let's pull equal amounts because we both have a bigger accounts than what we may have had if we had just dumped it all into his account, so.
I think one of the big takeaways here from this episode and why we wanted to share it, and we're not done here because there's a lot more work to be done here around visioning. They're talking about whether their families has enough protection in place and a few other nuances that we want to go into in the next episode. But the big takeaway I want you to have here is that, the idea of the Smith maneuver on its own is one that sometimes is fairly complex and takes some time for people to think about. But then there's some nuances here in terms of whose name, takes on the investments and what is it going to be invested in and when do I plan to start pulling from that? Like all of these variables are going to have an impact on what happens next. And even the investment that you put your borrowed funds into is going to have an impact. So as of now, there's really no clear-cut answer we can give because there isn't enough clarity around that piece. So in the next episode, we're going to dig into the visioning piece and helping this individual, we're calling him Daniel, and his family to determine what is that vision? What does it look like and sound like? How can you get on the right path? And then also, let's make sure when we look at stage 4, how do we ensure that we're going to protect the family now, protect the family and the assets into the future as well? So stick around for that. And we look forward to continuing the conversation.
If you want to know more about the pathways and the stages that we just talked about, stages 1 in vision, stage 2 in optimizing your wealth reservoir, stage 3 and thinking about your optimization structures that you have access to in the 4th stage, which is your legacy and estate planning, then head on over to CanadianWealthSecrets.com/pathways and take that assessment, and you will get a report that gives you where, an assessment of where you are on those stages and some next steps. And just a reminder, the content you heard here today is for informational purposes only. You should not construe any such information or other material as legal, tax, investment, financial, or other advice. One more reminder, Kyle Pearce is a licensed life and accident and sickness insurance agent and the president of corporate wealth management at Canadian Wealth Secrets.